Great. Well, welcome everybody, and especially wanted to thank Blake and Emily and Fred and Nancy Bass at the Strand bookstore for letting us use their amazing rare books room, which is very dangerous. I'll warn you, every time I pick up something, it's like James Joyce first edition 50,000. Put it down really carefully, and let's help them out by buying books to keep beautiful bookstores like this in business. And I wanted to thank Galen Williams, Harvey's love, who's been helping put this together with Norman Finkelstein, who is the editor of Harvey's new book, which we're celebrating, A Momentary Glory, tonight. And what we're going to do tonight is we've invited Harvey's closest friends and colleagues, and we're going to talk a little bit about Harvey, who is a poet with many beautiful books of poetry out, and he was an editor at the New York Times for 50 years. And so we're going to talk about what he meant to us and what his work meant to us, and then we're going to punctuate it with a lot of important people in his life coming up and reading poems from the new collection, which is on sale in the back. So the first person that I wanted to, and I'll just do the bios as I'm introducing everyone. So the first person here to our right is Grace Schulman, who's a very close friend of Harvey's and mine. And Grace Schulman is the author of 6 acclaimed books of poetry, including Days of Wonder, a finalist for the Phi Beta Kappa Award, the editor of the poems of Marianne Moore. She's Distinguished Professor of English at Baruch College, City University of New York. She was formerly poetry editor of The Nation and director of the Poetry Center at the 92nd Street Y. And I put Grace first because, aside from Harvey's kids, I think she's known him the longest here. And she says she's going to reveal some good stories about him. So you met him at Bard, is that correct?
Yes.
You need to put the microphone. Yeah.
Yes, it's true. I had known Harvey longer than anyone in this room, including his fine family. I was a student at Bard when Harvey taught there early in the 50s, and I'm glad Sue didn't mention the year. He was not my teacher. I wasn't good enough to get into his poetry workshop. He was a handsome young poet, kind, but with a gruff Humphrey Bogart drawl. When I tremblingly showed him my first poems, he said, "This is schoolgirl stuff. It's too conventional." I was crushed, of course, but not for long. I went to the library at Bard College. The library is open 24/7, and I stayed up all night writing poems for Harvey. And I worked and worked and worked for several nights. And I folded them into his mailbox, again, tremblingly. And he said, "Well, I liked your poems." And just those 4 words set me up. I was walking on air for a long time after that. Years later, I got to know Harvey quite well. We served on poetry panels. He read at the Y during my tenure. Somehow, I never got to remind him of that time at Bard, nor did I tell him about the day I passed his classroom and heard him reading Hart Crane's The Bridge aloud, his voice inspiring my lifetime dedication to poetry. I was half afraid that if I told him that, he would brush it aside in all modesty and say, well, it wasn't much, and diminish its importance in my life. But it was truly important to hear him reading that poem. And I tell it now, and I thank Harvey for encouraging a hard and beautiful life. Harvey wrote a poem during those years which appeared in one of his early books, which I happen to have. I kept it from that time, and I would love to read that poem, if I may, Sue. It's called The Heart. In the midst of words, your wordless image marches through the precincts of my night, and all the structures of my language lie undone. The bright cathedrals clatter, and the moon-top spires break their stalk. Sprawled before that raid, I watch the towns go under, and in the waiting dark, I loose like marbles spinning from a child, the crazed and hooded creatures of the dark.
Okay, why don't we have Mike Heller come up and read a poem, a Bright Winter City poem. Mike Heller, are you here? Okay, good. So, yeah, we're going to have people come up to the podium since we're taping it.
It's a great deal to me.
Good. I think they have a few more chairs. Okay, now we'd like to have Bob Hershon come up to read a poem for Harvey. And Bob was not only a close friend, but the publisher of Hanging Loose, who you published one of Harvey's books, right?
I did.
Good.
When he was on
Yeah.
a brief vacation from Hustler. When he was with the...
Yeah, here's some more chairs
When
over
he,
here, you guys.
When Harvey was at the Times, he thought it would be impolitic to do a book with a bigger house, so he found Tiny Hanging Loose, and we published a book. These are two poems that I chose because we published them in Hanging Loose magazine, but the real reason I chose them was... Sorry. These are two poems that Harvey read in Key West the last time we read together. So when I read them, I hear him, you know. This is called Pardoned. I don't have to spend my eternity in Queens because the family plot in Queens is as crowded as a subway at rush hour. Instead, I can choose my own ground and my own tree and my own crow to croak Kaddish. During the Second World War, I stood at the door of a B-17 with one engine on fire. I had been told to get ready to bail out. Beneath me were the snow-covered mountains of Yugoslavia. Around me was nothing but air. I wanted to stand there forever.
Thank you. And next to me, we have Phillip Lopate, who's the author of more than a dozen books, poetry, fiction, and 3 famous essay collections, Bachelorhood Against Joie de Vie and Portrait of My Body, and Waterfront. He directs the graduate nonfiction program at Columbia University and lives in Brooklyn with his wife and daughter. And I always quote, one of my favorite quotes that I tell my students who do first-person writing is that the problem with confessional writing in this country is people don't confess enough. So, Phillip, how did you know Harvey?
Well, I confess that I met him through Bill Zavatsky, who was a publisher of Sun Press and who put out 2 collections of my poetry. The Eyes Don't Always Want to Stay Open and the Daily Round. So when I met Harvey, I was not a student. I was already a published writer, and I was smitten with him. And immediately began to project onto him a father figure, which, if any of you have read my accounts of my father, is a dangerous thing, you know. Anyway, he took it well. But I saw him as some repository of a kind of stoical wisdom that was fast vanishing from this earth. There was this kind of hard-bitten quality about him. And he was very much both a newspaper man and a poet. My father had also been a newspaper man, and I remember watching my father cross out inessential words all the time. And I got the same feeling from Harvey, that he was always making things more concise and cutting out the words that didn't quite matter. And so it was a challenge to talk to him because, you know, the phone would ring and he'd say, "This is Harvey," you know, this growly voice, you know. And there'd be these silences, you know. and when I was with him and, engaging with him one-on-one in the same room, of course, it was a little easier. But even then, I would offer an opinion, and he would kind of think about it, like a poker player who holds his cards close to the vest. He wasn't going to say yes, or you're right, or that's ridiculous. He was going to turn it over, and so there was this kind of affection between us that was wrapped in silences. I was very attached to Harvey's attachment to the city and to jazz, less so to alcohol because I wasn't much of a drinker. But he had this feeling for New York City, and some of his poems, I think, are the quintessential New York poems. He gets it. He gets the rhythm, and when we hear these poems, I think in some ways they're like classical Chinese poetry, like Tu Fu, but sort of strained through Yiddishisms, sort of a Chinese Yiddish style. Anyway, I think that that my feeling for Harvey had a great deal to do with his poetry, and in a way it's always unfair to expect a writer to speak like his poems, to say, oh, I love that poem, can you just say another one, but I did feel that the words were coming from a deep silence, a kind of guardedness, and a kind of thoughtfulness that I really cherished.
Great, and perfect timing. Speaking of his city poems, Charlie Rubin is going to come up and read a poem of Harvey's from an older collection called Writing Westward. And actually, I met Harvey, the first time I met him through Hugh was at a breakfast at Yom Kippur, and I recited this poem to him, and he either was going to think I was a psycho or we were friends for life, so we became friends for life over this poem.
It's holiday night and crazy Jews are on the road. Finished with fasting and high on prayer on either side of the Long Island Expressway, the lights go spinning like the twin ends of my talus. I hope I can make it to Utopia Parkway, where my father lies at the end of his road, and then home to Brooklyn. Jews, departure from the law is equivalent to death. Shades, we greet each other darkly on the Long Island Expressway, where I say my own prayers for the dead. Crowded in Queens, remembered in Queens, as far away as Brooklyn. Cemeteries break against the city like seas, a white froth of tombstones, or like schools of herring still desperate to escape the angel of death. Entering the city, you have to say memorial prayers as he slides overhead, looking something like my father, approaching the ark as the gates close on the Day of Atonement. Here in the car, and in Queens, and in Brooklyn.
Thank you. Next, we're going to hear from Dennis Nurkse, who's the author of 9 previous books of poetry. His recent prizes include a Literature Award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters and a Guggenheim Fellowship, a former Poet Laureate of Brooklyn. He's also written widely on human rights. And I think, Dennis, you said you knew Harvey from the 70s?
I think so. Yeah. I met Harvey an awful long time ago. He was reading poetry at a place called the Basement Workshop, which was an Asian American radical poetry center. And it's funny, but looking out at this audience, I think many of you knew him as well as I did, though I knew him for a long time. He was a man of so many facets who seemed absolutely invested in whatever he did. I have to say that the first time I met him, I thought he was probably God because there was a very strong physical resemblance, which grew stronger as they both grew older. And Harvey was, in a strange way to me, a great religious poet, a great war poet, and a great love poet. And all of them, it was because he was passionate, and it was a passion that was kind of infused with a radical doubt. Though when he met Galen, the love poems didn't have the radical doubt that his earlier love poems had, but the war poems remained radically doubting. I think Geoffrey is in here, and he did that war anthology, and in his war anthology, it always moved me that in his anthology of poets of the Second World War, he put in poems by conscientious objectors and by women who were affected by the war, who didn't fight, and it never occurred to him to have a war anthology that would be just by soldiers. It moved me that he described himself as a religious, well, not quite as a religious, but he would talk about seeing his life in terms of, he has a beautiful line where he talks about walking around New York and he says, if you don't feel survivor guilt, you are adding to the darkness. I showed his poems to one of my students today because I was trying to explain why I am not teaching class tonight, and the student said, look at this line, nobody does silence as well as God. That's one of Harvey's lines. I wanted to read maybe 2 short religious excerpts from poems that Harvey wrote. One is in the 50s, maybe just topical for this time of the year. He writes, Feast of the Ram's Horn, let the player rise, and may the sound of that bent instrument in the 7th month before the 7th gate speak for all the living and the dead, and tell creation it is memorized. And that ending just twists and becomes kind of sassy. And that was his religious poetry. This is a poem from the 2000s, the 21st century. I hope I'm not treading on anybody's reading here, but he writes, who created you? Jacob J. Shapiro and Dorothy Cohen. They created me, and my dead sister Annette and my younger brother Alan. Who will uncreate you? Impossible to predict just now, but my money is on pastrami. But the weird thing is that that poem is getting more religious because now he's channeled himself into the book of Job. It's not who created me, it's who created you. And he's answering, and he's suddenly a Job figure talking to Yahweh. I think he was an amazing poet, and I just sort of want to conclude with that because he was an amazing man. I found out things about Harvey that I assume are true. For instance, that he was responsible for Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham County Jail. He asked that that be written, and he prompted the writing of that letter. But in some ways, I feel that his qualities as a man almost overshadow his poetry, you know, that if he weren't such a memorable figure and such a kind of Renaissance figure, his poetry would be better known, because I think he was an amazing poet, and a poet who spoke in a tradition of poets who have never been that well known in their lifetimes, like Charles Reznikoff, who was self-published, Louis Zukowski, but whose poems have lasted forever and will last forever, and I think Harvey is in that company.
Great, Dennis. Harvey told my class when we asked him about, he had commissioned the letter from Birmingham jail for Martin Luther King, and the other editors at the New York Times would not run it. They did not run it, and somebody said, why? And he just told my class, he says, because they were timid assholes. And they, and who ran it? It was a small literary, where? The Nation ran it? Yeah, so it was a smaller place wound up running it. Kathryn Levy is going to come up and read Departures.
Departures is one of the great valedictory poems in this wonderful volume, and I was reminded as I was reading the volume that when I would ask Harvey, I knew him, I guess, in the last 15 years of his life, I would ask him if he was writing. He would mumble something incomprehensible. And then one opens this book and reads poems like this and Psalm. He was somebody who kept things close to the vest, as we know. Departures, 1. A great ship steaming out of the mouth of the Hudson, shrouded in fog, past Battery, past Governor's Island, now blocking my view of the lady. A stately, silent exit, because so distant, while the traffic of the BQE buzzes beneath me. If I could send my 83 years out to sea like that, with all that I've done wrong, I could lay my head beside the golden door. 2. And now we enter the forest of Arden, where everything is possible, and the most haunting lyrics are sung by fools and clowns, and where I want to be. 3. Nobility of utterance was never my strong suit, nor nobility of style. I came to the table in my bathrobe and said what the night had taught me. 4. I've become bone clean and scentless. There is nothing for birds and small dogs to pick over. I've become a scarab for the muse to wear around her neck.
Next, Kimiko Hahn is the author of 5 previous books of poetry, including most recently Mosquito and Ant, and is a recipient of an American Book Award and a Lila Wallace Reader's Digest Award. She lives in Brooklyn, New York, and teaches at Queens College City University of New York. And Kimiko, you said you met Harvey in the 80s?
As Dennis said, I think so. It was over 25 years ago, so más o menos, right? First of all, I'm really honored to be here, so thank you to celebrate Harvey and his poetry and this book launch. Standing room only, amazing. It's just not surprising, amazing. You know, in the past year, I've been asked to say a few words here and there, some stories about Harvey, and I really don't have any fun stories. That's not the type of friendship I had with him. Certainly while Harold, my husband, and Galen, when we were all out to dinner, Galen and Harold would be talking about movies, and Harvey and I would be chatting about poetry. But really, my friendship that began, as I said, about 25 years ago, I'm really bad with names and well-known people and all of that. It's just a part of my brain that doesn't work. So when I met Harvey Shapiro, I didn't know who he was. I didn't know he was the Harvey Shapiro or who Harvey Shapiro was or anything. I thought he was just part of the hanging loose press gang that I was being initiated into, and I was so happy. And I think so I'd see Harvey at these readings as part of this hanging loose community, of which there are many of you here. I've known you all for 25 years or more. And one time we went after a reading to one of the big, huge dim sum places out in Sunset Park. And we just all sat there, and Harvey, for some reason, got stuck next to my 4-year-old, and he just was so lovely and had such an incredibly sweet conversation with her. I felt grateful for that and a little embarrassed when I found out who Harvey was, the Harvey Shapiro. So I was grateful and even more impressed. I love, and I'm repeating what many have already said, how gregarious Harvey was, incredibly funny. He had that quintessential New York sense of humor. I loved actually how damn vulgar he was, because it suits my own sensibility, how we'd have elegant poetry and then all of a sudden he'd use the word muff. Do you just throw that in there, and if you don't know what I'm talking about, just read his poetry. It was part of the fun of his work, that kind of high-low diction and imagery, and it was part of the scene. It was really sweet, and it was sweet and bad at the same time. And he also, I found, really cared about me as a writer. In fact, he's one of the few people I know, both writers and non-writers, who would always ask me what I was up to in my writing. He would always do that. And I feel that one of the greatest gifts a person can give a young person is to take them seriously. And that's what he did. He always took what I was doing seriously with great respect and true interest. And we'd talk about poetry and craft and subject matter. And as some of his students and just old friends have said, he just would give a kind of permission and respect that just has just lasting all these years, all these decades later.
Great. Geoffrey O'Brien is going to come up and read lines.
Oh, I was going to read it.
And Geoffrey was the publisher of the World War II Poets anthology that Harvey was in and so proud of.
It seems almost unthinkable for anyone but Harvey to read this poem aloud, because it comes about as close to silence as a poem can get, but I'll do my best. Lines. Corazon, O corazon, let the heart weep for this world and let nothing stay it in its weeping. It is all I wanted to do with my life, to sing with a harsh throb in my throat like a flamenco singer. Now I have the age for it. The doctors confer and try a new drug. The surgeon waits in the wings. I say to myself, time's on my side, and then the fat lady sings. When the sun sinks, my spirit sinks. Is age turning me into a sensitive plant? A man who has seen war and the destruction of cities? I walk these streets pushing sons in a stroller. Now I stumble down them alone. This poem was born in pain and exists in pain and will expire in pain. Pain and silence. In that old study where I used to sit, the family is sleeping beneath me. Not where I am now, in the wilderness of time, where the words sting like wind-driven rain. In that great loneliness that is the world, in that great loneliness from which we are gathered as light is gathered and dispersed, as starlight is gathered and dispersed among us, so that we can see each other, though the dark is immense and will cover us as light covered the deep.
Thank you. On the left is Norman Finkelstein, who's a poet and a critic, and Harvey Shapiro's literary executor, and really the person responsible for this beautiful posthumous A Momentary Glory, which we have for sale tonight. And he's a professor of English at Xavier University in Cincinnati, Ohio, and came in just for this event. So Norman, could you tell us anything about how you met Harvey and also maybe working with him on this collection?
I came in late to the story. I met Harvey only about 15 years ago. It was around 1999. So I guess the two questions that you're wondering are, one, how did I get to be his literary executor? And two, how did the book come about? So, I'll answer both of those questions very briefly. I was writing a book on Jewish American poetry in the mid-90s, and Rachel Duplessis said, well, you have to read Harvey Shapiro and you have to write about him. So I did, and then I realized that we had a number of mutual friends, Mike Heller, Hugh Seidman, and I wrote an essay about his work, which eventually became a chapter in my book, and he liked it. I sent it to him, he liked it very much, and I went out to East Hampton, I interviewed him, we got to know each other. I brought him to Xavier. He and Galen stayed with us. He gave a spectacular reading. This was shortly after 9/11, and interest in the fate of New York was very high. And it was shortly after that I got a call, kind of out of the blue. And he said, I want you to be my literary executor. I said, okay. What does that entail? Well, we weren't sure. but it had to do with the papers, and it wasn't going to happen for a long time, so it was going to be okay. So that's how I became his literary executor. Obviously, he trusted me on some level, and he liked what I had to say about the work. So time came around when I actually had to act as his literary executor, and I was actually reading at the Poetry Project. I was scheduled to read just about a week after he passed away, so it worked out that I was able to go to the apartment. The remaining files were laid out there, and I began to go through them. And it became very, very clear to me within an hour or less that there was a book materializing there, and there was probably a book that had been waiting for him to put it together, but his hospitalization kept him from that. And I was able to see that some of the poems were finished, absolutely finished, pure, beautiful typescript, and some were lightly edited, but still perfectly clear in terms of the changes that he had made. So Galen made me a photocopy of the manuscript, or what was to become the manuscript, and I basically categorized it in terms of the themes that we've been talking about in regard to his poetry tonight. But there's one thing that I need to say apropos of being a literary executor of Harvey Shapiro, and apropos of putting a book like this together, and that is, there were moments as I was working on this manuscript when I felt really severe doubts. The poems were still so clear and so beautiful, and yet I wondered, is this really what he wanted? Was there really a book there, or was I thinking only that there was a book there? And then I heard him say to me, "Schmuck, put the book together. You're my literary executor. That's what I chose you for." So then I went ahead and did it. And I'm going to read you just two little poems, and it's poems like this that assured me that I was on the right track. This is called Foggia, Italy. And both of these have not been published in magazines, as is the case with most of the poems in the book. He walks to the edge of the airfield to get aviation fuel for the steel drum rigged up in his tent as a stove. Rutted mud underfoot, but the spring sun on his face feels good. Low mountains in the distance through clear air. Everything shines because yesterday he was on a mission, and today, and probably for the next few days, he can ignore the early hour, the early morning whistle followed by the cry of H hour. Turn over, go back to sleep, get up and walk in the beautiful world. And then there's this, and it's just called writing. Writing, to put distance between myself and what I have written, so I am free to start another life. With that, he rose from his desk and left the room, to which he returns tomorrow. So I read poems like that, and I knew that this book had to come into being.
Great. Lawrence Joseph is going to come up and read Homage, The Distance.
Harvey was a poet's poet. Homage is has a epigraph from James Schuyler. And the epigraph is, "The ice-white eternal promise of a new moon. When you feel absolutely nothing, bone dead, brain dead, a body that eats and shits. Then to read lines set down in honest emotion, pleasure or pain, lines in which the emotion finds its way into words that spark a perception of something truly seen, can lift the heart." The Distance is a poem that is a prayer, and it's one of the themes or subjects of Harvey's poems from the very beginning, which is God's silence. The Distance. Prayer. as in my silence approaches God's silence. The distance to be covered is so immense that there is time to live my life peacefully.
I'm going to tell one other quick Harvey story, which was that when I first met Harvey, it was before he met Galen in the 80s, and as anyone knows from reading his poems, Harvey had a lot of girlfriends. He liked women a lot. And we used to hang out and go to movies and plays, and he would get me in everywhere because he knew every cool book party or every pen event, any event that was great, he would take me to. And at one point when we were hanging out, he flirted and he came on to me, and I liked him, but I thought he was 38 years older than me. And a couple therapy sessions later, I basically said to him, that's too old. Like, you're awesome, and I'm crazy about you, but it's too much age difference. So cut to, in the 90s, I was working on a book called Only as Good as Your Word, which was about all my favorite, most important mentors, and I wrote a whole chapter about him, which was 40 pages, because he was so important to me as a poet and also poetry mentor and also as my editor at the New York Times. And like Phillip said, I believe in confessing, and people don't confess enough. So I told the truth about how we met. And because he was still at the New York Times and still my editor there, I thought, you know what, I'm going to show him the manuscript before it goes to press, which I hardly ever do to anybody. But I thought, for Harvey, I'm going to do it, and I'm worried, but if he wants to change that, if he wants to change anything, he can do it. So he read it, and he called me, and he said, okay, Sue, there's just one thing you have to change. And I'm like, what? He said, you know that part where you say I came on to you? And I was like, yeah, you want me to take it out? I'll take it out. He said, no, I don't want you to take it out. I want you to tell the truth. So I'm like, oh, what's the truth? And he said, what happened before I came on to you? And I'm like, I don't know. We were hanging out, we were drinking, we were partying. He said, you got me stoned on this really strong Hawaiian weed. And I'm like, yeah. He said, put that in there. So I thought he was joking. You know, I thought he's, New York Times editor, so I started laughing. I'm like, I'll just take out the paragraph. He's like, no, put that sentence in there. So I put the sentence in there, and I read it to him. So it says, we're hanging out, and I got him stoned on this really great weed, and then he came on to me, and I said, no, sorry, you're too old. I said, you're for real? That's what you want? He's like, yes. Now I okay it. That's how I want it. So I asked my husband, I was like, he's an editor at the New York Times, like posterity, why does he want that in there? And he said, because in his day, if you got him stoned, that means you really wanted it. So that's how it stays in my memoir of Harvey. Okay, next up to read is Bill Zavatsky, and he's reading On a Rejection Note from Paul Muldoon, Now I Write.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for putting this together, Susan, and thank you all for coming. And I'm going to read two poems, actually. The first I'll read is a poem called Now I Write. Now I write to prove to myself that there is nothing for me to write about, and that the time I spend reading, watching television, or just staring into space is only the rich, well-deserved leisure of old age. How to write poems of perfect resignation when what's on tap is rage, enmity, and a wish to do it all over again, but this time get it right. Because I am someone on whom you can't rely. The witnesses are many. I was chosen to write these poems that pretend to experience love and awe of creation, but only to solicit a sigh, some sympathy, a free pass to what is there. Harvey being very hard on himself. Paul Muldoon, you may know, is a poet and the poetry editor of The New Yorker. That's the footnote from me. So this is called On a Rejection Note from Paul Muldoon. Paul writes that he wants me at my most exhilarating. Paul, let's be reasonable. I'm 86. I've probably been at my most exhilarating. I can remember when I was exhilarated maybe 3 or 4 times a week. Isabel did that. And I was exhilarating in turn. So she said, and I could transfer that energy to the page. Now I can be cunning, skillful, maybe even wise. Let's settle for that. Yours truly, Harvey. What a great book. Thank you, Norman.
Okay, and Hugh next to me found a poem that he's going to read of Harvey's also.
Thanks, Sue. I just wanted to say one more thing before I read this poem, that aside from everything else, Harvey was a good friend to me, one of my best friends in a certain way. Not that we hung out all the time together, but I felt that about him. It's very moving to read these poems because I knew Harvey so well. And Harvey was a good friend to my wife, Jane. Early on in our relationship, Jane and I broke up for a while, and Harvey remained friends with Jane, as well as with still remaining friends with me, so I thank him for that. This is called Rabbi Nachman's Parable. And I read this poem, I don't know if it's Harvey's greatest poem, but I found myself, as I was reading through the volume that I got in the mail from Wesleyan, I kept reading this poem. I must have read it a dozen times, and every time I read it, I totally enjoy reading it as if it's the first time I've ever read it. So I'll read it tonight. Rabbi Nachman's Parable, and of course, Harvey was a great fan of Rabbi Nachman, and I think that one of Harvey's sons is going to read a Rabbi Nachman, invoke Rabbi Nachman at some point in the reading. Rabbi Nachman's Parable. It was the king's son, naked under the table, convinced he was a turkey, gobbling bones and bread. The king coaxed, the queen coaxed. Maidens were brought from as far away as Persia. Still he roosted and dreamed foul dreams. A wise man stepped forward to do the work. He stripped and under the table introduced himself. Just another turkey. They gobbled together. At a signal, a shirt was thrown to the wise man. Did you think, he said, that a turkey cannot wear a shirt and still be a turkey? Then there followed pants, the rest of clothing, food. Then the wise turkey said, do you think a turkey must sit under the table? You can be a turkey and sit right at the table. So they did.
Great. Before we have a couple more people come to read poems, I wondered if there was anyone in the audience so far that has any questions for any of the panelists, anything else you want us to talk about, or does anybody have any memories of Harvey that they wanted to share themselves before we go on to read the last few poems? Anybody have any questions? Yes.
Just a memory. My wife.
You want to do it up here? Yeah. Please.
When my wife first moved here from Detroit in 1979, I said, I want to invite Harvey over for dinner. And so Harvey came to dinner, and we had a very pleasant evening. It was just the three of us. And after he left, because Harvey did know everybody in the world, between the Times and poetry, it was, and then once he met Galen, of course, there was nobody left. But Donna said to me, George Balanchine's name had come up, and Harvey said, "Oh yeah, George, he was a lot of fun at a party." And after he left, Donna said, "What was that about? George was a lot of fun at a party?" I said, "Not only was he a friend of Balanchine's, but he used to date Maria Tallchief and Tanaquil Leclerc." I asked Harvey once, "How did you ever meet Maria Tallchief?" And he said, I picked her up at a bookstore in Boston.
Good. Any other questions or stories? Anyone else? No? Okay, let's have Dan. Harvey's son, Dan Shapiro, is going to come up and read A Momentary Glory.
A momentary glory. This world is a momentary glory. I never thought it would last forever, so I tried to get it down in one notebook or another, in one poem or another. Somewhere you can find it.
And Saul Shapiro is going to come up and read Psalm. Harvey's other son, Saul.
Before I start, I wanted to say, Norman, I don't think you should have any doubts about how thrilled my dad would be with the book, and also Sue with this evening, and also for all of you for coming here. I mean, I think it's very hard before you go to imagine what's going to follow you, but I don't think he quite imagined this, and I think he would be very touched. I'm going to read Psalm, which is at the very end of the book, and is also appropriate for the time of year, and it talks about the end of his life, and the last line of the poem also is what my children were campaigning very hard for me to put on his tombstone after they gave up the idea of, he has a very short poem which says, "Death floats my boat," and they were for a long time campaigning for "Death floats my boat" on the tombstone. And we got off of that, and then it got to the end of what comes at the end of Psalm, which you'll hear. I'm still on a rooftop in Brooklyn on your holy day. The harbor is before me, Governor's Island, the Verrazzano Bridge, and the Narrows. I keep in my head what Rabbi Nachman said about the world being a narrow bridge, and that the important thing is not to be afraid. So on this day, I bless my mother and father, that they be not fearful where they wander. And I ask you to bless them. And before you close your book of life, your Sefer HaChaim, remember that I always praised your world and your splendor, and that my tongue tried to say your name on Court Street in Brooklyn. Take me safely through the Narrows to the sea.
Okay, we have a few more poems that are going to be read. Jane Augustine is going to read A Mother of Invention.
These are two beautiful poems from the new book that carry out an echo of an earlier poem, but also the influence of Asian and Chinese poetry, as well as the Buddhist path. The Mother of Invention. On my desk are the bills from the living, and in my sleep are the bills from the dead. Emptiness is the mother of invention, says my fortune cookie. July 23rd, 2010. Brooklyn. I walk in the slow rain, never less accomplished, never happier. Why should I doubt the world has meaning when even in myself I see mysterious purposes? A crow drops down for a moment, black rabbinical garb, croaking Kaddish. Questions. What is it you thought you knew? When? When you were sure of something, when you believed the words would lift you up. Lift me up? Yes, as in a trance, as in a fever of believing. That was the booze. No, that was before the booze. Well, I was very young. I was intoxicated. And now? And now I work at it. A little light before the darkness.
Okay, so is there anybody else, before we do the last poem, is there anyone else who has any questions? Anybody else in the panel want to add anything? Anybody want to, any other Harvey stories?
I would just add, you know, if you're a politician and you die, everybody talks about the people you killed. But if you're a poet, I think it's an amazing thing that we are left with a book that is made by Norman and by Galen after his death, and that we're going home to discover a new part of the person in the form of a book. So I'm very grateful for this endeavor.
Great, and we're going to end with, there's a poem that Hugh wants to read that Harvey wrote to Galen.
For Galen. The way the gifts tumble from you all day because you are a woman. I never get a chance to say thank you before you're on to the next. A turn, a smile, a hand on my sleeve. I feel almost embarrassed that I can't do Harvey's voice justice if Harvey were here to read these poems, but I did my best.
All right, I wanted to thank all the panelists here tonight, and especially Emily and Blake and Nancy and Fred Bass at the Strand bookstore for letting us use their beautiful rare books room and buy books. Buy books. This is the most awesome place to buy books in the world. They make amazing presents, and especially want to thank Norman Finkelstein for having us all. Really, you're responsible for the book, and this evening, A Momentary Glory, Harvey's last poems. Thank you guys so much for coming.
And a round of applause for Sue.